Marvelous, marvelous. Thank you so very much for inviting me here. I want to make sure you all can see my screen as well. Am I correct by assuming this?
Yes, you are.
Marvelous, marvelous. Again, I just want to make sure that everyone is cool. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me here. My name is Dr. Calvin Derone Harvell. Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction of me. It is customary that before I begin any type of talk that I must first pay homage to my ancestors. I need to call the name of my mother, Lillian Geraldine Harvell, who has crossed the river to go home to be with the ancestors, but who will never be forgotten. And I ask that she gives me the power to speak, the truth on this particular day, and to speak the truth with power. The next thing that I must do before I begin any conversation is make sure I recognize those folks that we usually do not recognize. And I have to start this conversation with a very important statement. And that statement is, it is the unseen work, it is the unseen labor of Black women that allow Black men to go into spaces and be seen as if they are more important than what they actually are. Now, in no way am I suggesting that I'm not an important person, but at the same time, I want to make sure that I always recognize and call on the names of my wife and my daughter, Ashley Mae and Lillian Kay, in terms of getting me to the spaces that I need to be. And so today I'm going to be talking about the idea of taking equity to the next level. But now what becomes extremely important about this idea of taking equity to the next level is that we must first problematize the ideal of equity. My argument is that I do not believe that we can go to the next level because we have not truly began to deal with each other. We have not truly began to engage in real critical conversations about equity. And so equity has never been a true part of the so-called United States. And so one of the first things that I need to talk about is the ideal of what Molefe Keteasante calls location. Where are we located? Now, of course, a lot of times when we talk about the notion of location, right, you all are going to tell me, well, I'm in this virtual spot. I'm in my office. I'm on my sofa. I'm in my bed. I'm in my house, or something of this nature. So we're talking about a type of physical location, which of course we're dealing with issues of land, but we also want to talk about the ideal of our intellectual location. What becomes extremely important is that Dr. Wade Nobles talks about the idea of what are called conceptual prisons. And one of the things that we talk about, or one of the things I'm trying to get us to understand as we problematize the ideal of equity, is that in many cases we are trapped in these conceptual prisons that do not allow us to even begin the proper conversations or to act in equitable ways. What do I mean by this? Malana Karenga tells us that the most powerful thing in the world is to construct reality and have people accept it, even when it is to their own disadvantage. I got to say that one more time. The most powerful thing in the world is to construct reality and have people accept it, even when it is to their own disadvantage. And so in many cases, when we look at the notion of equity, we have not been able to break the conceptual prison because we are playing by the rules or using the same playbook as the people in power. We are playing by the rules or using the same playbook as the people in power, or what Schwartz calls the master script. And we already know that the people in power essentially create self-serving rules, create self-serving interests. What does Marx tell us? Marx tells us that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. And so one of the things that I want to challenge us to think about today, okay, is that we talk about the notion of equity, but can equity actually work in a system where the country constantly focuses on the ideas of equality? And it's always interesting because we talk about the notion of equality as if we all began equal. We act as if we do not recognize that we came into a pre-existing social system where stratification was already in operation. And when we talk about the notion of stratification, I don't have to play with this thing. We know we're talking about what? Racial stratification, a sexual orientation. We're talking about issues of class, talking about issues of religion, talking about issues of ethnicity, etc. And so when we talk about this idea, this becomes extremely important. Can we actually have equity in a country such as the so-called United States? Now, of course, it sounds good and it sounds cute, but we have to break these conceptual prisons. What do I mean by this? Well, friends, when we look at the ideal of culture, what is culture? Culture is knowledge, values, beliefs, and material objects that are passed from person to person, one society to the next, and one generation to the next. We have two different types of culture. We have the ideal culture, is what you profess to be true, but then you have the real culture, which means what is really true about your culture. And so my argument today, friends, when we talk about the notion of advancing equity, is can we actually get to a space of equity? because the question that we have to look at, or what we have to make sure we understand, is that equity goes against the ideal, the real culture of the so-called United States. Let's be honest about this. Equity is anti-patriotic. Equity is anti-colonial. Equity is anti-capitalism. Patriotism, colonialism, and capitalism are the foundations of the so-called United States. And so when we start talking about working or getting to the next level of equity without beginning to dismantle certain structures, without beginning to dismantle certain ideologies, well, then our talks are of sound and fury and signify nothing, which means that our talks themselves are more about symbolic changes than substantive changes. And so when we talk about the ideas, for example, of things being race neutral, let's be honest with this. We can talk about race neutral because when we talk about race neutral, everything in terms of race neutral policies are already centered in whiteness. The same ways as we talk about things as being sexually neutral or gender neutral. We can talk about these things now because we've come into a pre-existing structure where everything is already centered on maleness. And so if we already have certain groups that are at the center, and then we begin to talk about things as being neutral, once again, more symbol than substance. And so it becomes extremely important for us to look at Dr. John Henry Clark. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but Dr. Clark talks about something very important. This is a question of land and a question of equity as well. Again, if we're talking about moving into areas of equity, my argument is that the conversations have not truly started because we have not addressed these three myths and the ways in which these three myths still inform everything that we do in the so-called United States, and the meaningful ways in which this essentially has created a worldview for the interactions of this country throughout the global level. And so again, I know some people are not close to their computer, so I'll read these very briefly. Dr. Clark says the myth of a people waiting in darkness for another people to bring them light. He says the myth of a people without a legitimate God, the myth of the primitive or the aborigine, the myth of the invader as as conqueror or civilizer. Think about how powerful this is. If we began our conversation with these three myths, and these three myths are the foundation that set the cornerstone for the so-called United States, that set the cornerstone for the structure of this particular system, until we begin to systematically deconstruct, systematically dismantle these particular myths, we can't even begin to have serious and critical talks about equity. And so once again, our talks about equity are not actually serious in terms of equity. One of my greatest statements, or one of the funniest things that I always find when I go to certain businesses and organizations, they talk about the idea of they have an equity office. Think of the implication of that. The equity of your organization, the equity of your school, the equity of your business lives in an office. And that's where it always stays at. The talks are structured within an office. If we're truly talking about equity, equity has to be a way of life, right? We think about equity as what? Fairness. Equity is parity. Parity. This has to be an actual way of life. It cannot live in an office, because what happens is that it gets trapped in that office again, trapped in this conceptual prison. And therefore, folks are confused, or confusion on the battlefield overall. And so when we look at the ways, again, we look at those four myths, we have to now think about the ways in which people have developed their ethnic or racial identity. And what becomes extremely important about developing these things is we have to understand that the way that we came into the system was unequal in the first place. The way that we came into the structure was unequal in the first place. So based on unequal power relationships. If you have these unequal power relationships, well, think of the ways in which certain people are going to be looked at predicated on their ethnicity. Think of the ways in which certain people are going to be looked at predicated on their race. Think of what this essentially is going to mean in terms of the ways in which these people are going to be treated, and the ways in which the justification for the mistreatment, the ways in which the justification for the racism, the ways in which the justification for discrimination, the ways in which the justification for even expulsion and genocide will essentially operate against those people. And so when we talk about issues of equity, we have to make sure we're talking about something very important that no one seems to want to talk about. Like it's like we forgot about this, right? You go to school and you study philosophy, they talk about the so-called social contract. Well, Mills says that there's more than a social contract. Mills' work tells us that there is a racial contract. And I want you to think about how powerful this is. Again, when we start talking about issues of land and giving land back, we start talking about issues of reparations. And what does reparations mean? To repair or make amends for some type of wrongdoing, which means the wrongdoing could have happened yesterday, the wrongdoing can happen today, or it could have happened a couple thousand years ago. But when we look at the racial contract, we cannot have conversations of equity or reparations or land back without having a full and critical understanding of the racial contract. And again, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence by reading this particular thing because it's up here on the screen. But in simple terms, what the racial contract says is that there is one group of people that are in power. There's one group of people who have been defined as superior. And I want you to think about the notion of defining as superior, right? I'm defined as superior and have used various institutions to justify their superiority. The religion, education, mass media, politics, government, laws, we can keep on going. In fact, all of the institutions, the entire superstructure justifies the superiority of these groups. So for example, there was something throughout history called the European chain of being. The European chain of being says that just as in nature, human beings are ranked in a hierarchy. Think about that. Just as in nature. So in simple language, some people are ranked as lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Well, we know that the lions and tigers and bears are the king of the jungle, the baddest things in the jungle, the baddest things out in the forest. But then those folks, and of course, when they set the European chain of being, it was European groups, okay? And so what ultimately happened is that even within the European chain of being, there were some Europeans on the top and some were on the bottom. And friends, we've seen the outcome to those who were defined as being on the bottom. Think about what happened in terms of the Holocaust. That group was defined as being in the bottom. Think about our Irish friends or our Polish friends, right? There's a very important book called How the Irish Became White. Now, many folk will say, well, hold on, Dr. Harvell, the Irish are already white. No, there was this idea that folks had to go through an assimilation process. They had to cast off certain aspects of their ethnicity. They had to lose their accent, lose their language, lose their religion in order to embrace somebody else's, those folks defined at the top. Well, friends, if you can look at the ways in which certain groups who were defined as European were treated in terms of this racial contract, well, what do you think happens when this same group who is defined as being superior comes in contact with people who are Asian, with people who are indigenous, with people who are Black, with people who are Latino? Think about what's going to happen to those particular folks. If you can have an entire Holocaust to essentially eliminate an entire group of individuals, we shouldn't be shocked. We shouldn't be shocked at questions of land. We shouldn't be shocked at the ideal of expulsion. We shouldn't be shocked that there was certain indigenous populations right here in what later became the so-called United States were expelled. We shouldn't be shocked at the African Holocaust and the enslavement of those Africans. We should not be shocked by these things. If folks can do this to the folks who are defined as their own brothers and sisters, what do you think is going to happen? However, the racial contract said that it was a systematic understanding that European nations, it was their duty. You all have heard these terms, right? But a lot of times we don't connect them to the racial contract. You've heard the terms of manifest destiny, right? It is the will of God that the so-called United States is supposed to encompass all land between the eastern and western seaboard. Right? And we know how that essentially happened. It wasn't just showing up and getting on the land and just saying that it was mine. It was what? Starting on the eastern seaboard and shooting my way across. And whoever was in my way, no big deal. Right? We've heard of the notion of the white man's burden. The white individuals, it is their burden. I have to go out and civilize the rest of the world. Again, this is a part of the racial contract, but in many cases, we don't use these particular terms. But notice it is a contract. It is an agreement that the rest of the world is uncivilized, except for those folks who are defined as being European, as being Europeans. So how do we get to this thing? So when we talked about the notion of the racial contract, one of the things that it said is that there were these places that were untamed that need to be tamed. There was this wilderness that was untamed that need to be tamed. There were folks who need to be civilized, folks who need to be brought into civilization. There has to be something that has to happen to make them better than what they are. Now, the first question we should be asking is what's wrong with them folks in the first place? Well, see, the racial contract, the reason we can't get to equity, the reason we are confused on the battlefield is we don't question the ideal of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the belief that everything about you, your culture, your religion, your style of dress, the clothes you wear, it's superior to everybody else, and therefore the only logical standard by which to judge everybody else. So when we talk about the idea, going back to the racial contract, with the creation of pejorative terms to define certain people who are in spaces that need to be removed, the creation of identifying these folks, think about how powerful this language is. And we know that language shapes the view of reality of the speakers. What does it mean when I say that somebody lives in the ghetto? What does it mean when I say that somebody lives in the hood? Or somebody is urban, impoverished, or underdeveloped, right? This language is only an extension of the original colonial project. And so the fact that we're still using these particular terms, again, we're not getting into any discourse of equity. And so one of the things that I say that if we're going to be critical about discourses of equity is we must begin to use what is called disruptive pedagogy. We have to question the difference between somebody settling and somebody conquering somebody. There's a difference there. We have to question the notion of somebody being a pioneer, as many of our social studies books taught us when we were 5 and 6 and 7 years old, versus somebody being a home invader. You come to my house right now and kick down the door, and I say, oh my goodness, you were just coming to settle here. No, you are a home invading monster. We have to make sure, I want to make sure I'm critical of my time. Think about the ways in which it's caused what is called racial battle fatigue. All right. So we have these identities that have been shaped by these unequal power relationships. We have these identities of various racial groups that have been shaped by unequal power relationships. What does this do to the victims of these particular constructs? This becomes extremely important for us to make sure we understand, which ultimately leads to the ideal of what is called racial trauma. And when we think about racial trauma, sometimes we think about trauma as only being physical. Friends, I'm sorry. We talk about the issue of equity. And in one sentence, I'm talking about equity. But again, because equity only lives in the office, how can I advance equity? How can I be critically talking about equity when 3 weeks ago, I celebrated somebody called Christopher Columbus Day? When 3 weeks ago, I celebrated the genocide. And think about what genocide means. Genos comes from 2 Latin words. Genos, which means nation, side, which means killing. The systematic eradication of an entire group of people defined as undesirable, unwanted, and unnecessary. I celebrate Christopher Columbus. And then, of course, right, I'm embarrassed to say that at my own institution, we said, oh, we're going to celebrate Christopher Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. Wait a minute. You're going to celebrate me and my executioner at the same time? Tokenized ideologies of equity. And a couple of weeks from now, we talk about equity, and this is racial trauma. And folks are going to be engaged in what? The systematic celebration of Thanksgiving, which once again says what? That there's a group of people who do not and should not have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we're going to celebrate